All right, so for the last few weeks, we've kind of been moving forward through time, right? Like we started with these early modern theorists. We started with Hobbes, then we moved on to Kant, then we did Marx, then we did Gramsci, Adorno, Habermas. It's all, they all followed each other through time, and engaged in a similar tradition of thought as well. Today, though, by contrast, we're going to take a step back and maybe a step to the side as well. We're going to return to pre- and slightly post-war international relations theory and look at the work of Carl Schmitt. This is a step to the side in the sense that Carl Schmitt doesn't really engage in the same kind of debates as the theorists that we've been discussing up until now. You could argue whether he's a critical theorist at all, but I think he offers something that's quite intriguing for understanding international relations and world order that situates, historicizes, and arguably undermines this realist view of IR. In saying that, however, he has been referred to as a kind of realist himself, an institutional realist. So Schmitt he's kind of in a somewhat odd position in this course. As usual, when we have time, we'll look at his life very briefly, then we'll look at his idea of sovereignty, the friend-enemy distinction, and finally his idea of the nomos. Okay, so Schmitt was born in Germany in the town of Plettenberg in 1888. He read law at universities in Berlin, Munich, and Strasbourg, and graduated in 1915. He earned his habilitation in 1916 at the University of Strasbourg, and then taught in various business schools at universities around the country, such as Greifswald, the University of Bonn, the Technical University of München, and the University of Cologne, and the University of Berlin. So he got around quite a bit, taught in a lot of different places. Worth noting in the context of this course is that he had kind of an odd relationship to the rise of Nazism, which of course was something occurring during this period. For instance, initially he advocated that the Nazi Party be suppressed, and he lobbied the Weimar Republic's president to have the leadership of the Nazi Party imprisoned. A common view at that time was that though the Nazi Party were extreme, once they were brought into the government, right, once they were faced with the realities of actually having to govern a country, they'd moderate, and they'd become just like any other party in the German parliament. Schmitt disagreed with this. He thought that the Nazi Party couldn't be controlled within the current system, and in the end, history proved him right in that regard. But after saying all of this, Schmitt himself joined the Nazi Party in 1933, and he became a fervent supporter. And he became actually quite important in the Nazi regime. He'd been described as the Nazis' crown jurist. So within days of joining the Nazi Party, he joined people in burning books by Jewish authors and books, containing un-German or anti-German material. He was appointed state councillor for Prussia by Hermann Goering himself and became the president of the Union of National Socialist Jurists. He also claimed that his theories were the ideological foundation of the Nazi dictatorship. And on top of all of this, Schmitt presented himself as a radical anti-Semite and demanded that German law be cleansed of its Jewish spirit. He even demanded that publications by Jewish scientists should be marked with a small symbol. But despite all of this, in some ways it's kind of hard to take him entirely seriously on this. Because, of course, he had argued previously against and actually published books decrying exactly the kind of romantic German nationalism that he now claimed to be supporting. And actually the German authorities themselves suspected that his conversion to Nazism was opportunistic rather than ideological. And in 1936, an SS publication accused Schmitt of being an ungenuine anti-Semite. I mean, it's hard to decide whether being an opportunistic Nazi is better or worse than being a genuine Nazi, but it seems that that's pretty much what he was, an opportunistic Nazi. At the end of the war, he was captured by American forces. He refused every attempt at denazification, which meant that he couldn't get an academic job for the rest of his life, which is probably fair enough. So he was isolated from the mainstream of German intellectual life. But he did continue to research and publish, including some of his most important work, and he'd have frequent visitors, many of whom were quite high-profile philosophers and theorists. So he ended up having what might be described as a subterranean influence on German political thought. He eventually died in 1985. Now, one of Schmitt's key ideas, and probably his most famous line, maybe a line that you've encountered before in IR, at least in the English-speaking world, it's one of the more famous lines anyway, is that sovereign is he who decides on the exception. And this, of course, is the title of this week. Both of the theorists we're looking at this week think about this idea of the exception. Schmitt's idea of the exception offers a significantly different approach from the typical way of understanding sovereignty in traditional international relations theory. According to traditional IR theory, sovereignty and state are pretty much coterminous, right? You can't easily separate sovereignty and the state. Without having sovereignty, you don't have states, and without states, you don't have sovereignty. They go together, right? Things are not quite so simple in Schmitt's thought, however. The basic idea in traditional theory is that sovereignty is the monopoly on the legitimate use of violence within a territory, right? I'm sure you've heard that description before. Now, this doesn't mean, of course, according to the traditional theory, that there actually is, in practice, only one source of violence, of legitimate violence within that territory. Sorry, it doesn't mean that in practice there is only one source of violence, but it means that there's only one source of legitimate violence. So, if you as a private citizen were to attack another private citizen, that would be violence, but it would be illegitimate violence. The state, on the other hand, they can legitimately step in and use violence to lock up or kill a person who has broken the law or whatever. Typically as well, the state is the only organization, the only group that's allowed certain weapons. And even if other people in that state are allowed weapons, they're only allowed to use them in ways that the state says is okay. Of course, on top of this, the state is also the only group that's allowed to declare war on other states. So a state has sovereignty if, within a certain territory, it controls the monopoly on legitimate violence in terms of questions of justice, right? And it decides who gets punished, how, and for what. It's the only actor that's allowed armies and organized forces of violence, right? So if you organize a force yourself and you refuse to do what the government says, your actions are considered illegitimate, and the government can attack you. Now, you could defend yourself with force, of course, but you don't have the right to defend yourself with force. That right to defend yourself with force, when you do have it, say if someone attacks you in the street or something, that ultimately derives from the state. The state gives you permission to use violence to defend yourself. You don't have that right intrinsically. And, of course, as I said, the state is the only actor who can use violence against the enemies of the state externally. So this is a pretty familiar idea, I think. Goes back all the way to Hobbes, so it sort of underlies a lot of Hobbes's thought there. But Max Weber was the one who cashed out the concept in the particular way I just described it here. Now, Schmitt isn't a particularly big fan of this way of understanding sovereignty for a number of reasons. So first, it's not obvious to him that control of a territory is what sovereignty is all about. This seems to him to be maybe a particular kind of sovereignty that is associated with modern states, and not with sovereignty generally. And we pretty much take it for granted now as something a state can do, but it's actually, he thinks, a historically situated kind of sovereignty. Secondly, the idea of legitimacy assumes a stable kind of legal order in which every possible scenario can be captured. Now, what I mean by this is that the state has to be all-encompassing. Its legal order has to be able to make sense of, to integrate any specific event that occurs within that state. right? But there are always going to be things, according to Schmitt, and I think he's right about this, that aren't able to be resolved within that legal order as it currently exists. There will always be emergencies, there will always be exceptions to the laws as they currently stand. No law can be so total, or no system of law can be so total that nothing ever happens that can't escape that law, can't be outside it, can't be it fail to be covered by it. Now, because of this, Schmitt thinks that the real power of the sovereign is the power to decide. They get to decide when something counts as an exception. They get to decide when something does or does not fit the current legal order. They get to decide when a rule needs to be suspended because of an exception, because of an emergency. Now, really importantly for Schmitt, it's not that the sovereign works out that something should be an exception, right? They don't say, okay, we've got this legal order. According to this legal order, such and such counts as an exception, and so we need to suspend such and such rule. So it's not just the application of rules here. The sovereign decides this. It's an actual decision that they make. They don't observe it. They don't apply a system that already exists in the background to this exceptional case. They actually decide it. They make it to be the case. So the sovereign decides that a situation is exceptional, and they decide what to do about this exceptional case. All right? And it's this ability to decide that characterizes the sovereign and sovereign power. Now, every time they do this, every time they decide that something is an exception and decide what to do about that exception, the sovereign creates a new juridical order, a new system of laws. We can say then in this context for Schmitt that all law is situational law. So there's no such thing as some abstract, pre-existing legal order that we then just apply to particular cases. Rather, he thinks the decisions made by the sovereign, or those appointed by the sovereign to decide something within certain bounds, such as judges, actually create the law in practice. And this contrasts, I think, with the dominant view of the law, that if any of you study law, this is kind of the assumption, the philosophy that underlies your study of law. In fact, I'm sure, that sees law as simply purely a matter of application. So the job of those in positions of legal power is not to decide on what the law is, right? Their job is to work out what the law is. So, you've got this legal order in the background, and a judge's job is not to make something the case, to make a law, right? That's the job of Parliament. The judge's job is to work out what the law really is and always was. And this is not Schmitt's view at all, right? The law arises for him out of genuine decisions made in particular situational cases. So I think already perhaps you can see that Schmitt's view starts to diverge a bit from realism. The sovereign's power lies not in their ability to use force, but in their ability to constitute a juridical order, a legal order, through their own decisions about what counts as an exceptional case and what to do about those exceptional cases. Now, the second idea I want to discuss is the friend-enemy distinction. This is actually the basis of Schmitt's entire conception of what the political is. So all political actions, all political motivations, he thinks, can be basically understood, reduced to this distinction between friend and enemy. And this seems kind of obvious in a way, but it's actually not as obvious as it might seem at first. And one of the reasons why is that in the liberal tradition of political theory, which is the dominant tradition these days, politics is about the public good, right? And that's something we found in Habermas last week, trying to work out what is in the good of all of the participants in discourse. So politics is this process of working through various conflicts in a way that allows us to get to some kind of common good or general will, or what's best for the community. Now, Schmitt disagrees with this completely. He doesn't think this is the case at all. And this is one of the reasons why he's often called realist. Because realists, they also think, with Schmitt, that the fundamental nature of the interstate system is that of conflict. And they think you can't move beyond this conflict, right? States are always going to be in conflict with other states, whether actively in conflict or potentially in conflict. Basically, they think international relations is this zero-sum game. If one state gets better off, then another state is going to be worse off. So Schmitt agrees with some of this, but he doesn't think realists get it quite right, right? And again, this is because he thinks realists just focus too much on the state. They take the state for granted. Because Schmitt thinks that this friend-enemy distinction is actually more fundamental than states. So conflict between friends and enemies, it's not the same thing as conflict between states. It's more fundamental. And in fact, Schmitt is not a fan of any kind of theory that determines in advance who will be friend and who will be enemy, right? And that's what a theory of states and realism does, right? It says you've got different states, and these states are all enemies of each other. Now, for Schmitt, it may be the case descriptively now that the best way to draw the friend-enemy distinction is between states. That could actually turn out to be the case. But he doesn't think that this is a natural, obvious thing you can just derive from first principles. You can't say there's anarchy and therefore you've got blah, 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 like realism tries to do, right? It tries to derive this conflict between states from these first principles. If there is conflict between states, Schmitt thinks it's just this, it happens to be an empirical description of a certain state of affairs that exists right now, but it's not something that is just this natural state of affairs. So for Schmitt, only participants, not some kind of abstract theory, can correctly recognize, understand, and judge the concrete situation, judge who's friend and who is enemy. Only participants can work out how the friend-enemy distinction applies in practice. And the basic idea behind the friend-enemy distinction of Schmitt's is it's primarily a sociological distinction. So he thinks that so long as there are human beings, there are going to be groups, collectivities of human beings, and so long as there are collectivities, then war is always going to be a basic possibility in the world, right? It's just tied to the very logic of group existence. According to Schmitt, then, war, or the possibility of war, is just this basic feature of the world, something you can't get rid of, right? And so he thinks we can either accept it and manage it, or try to manage it, or we can deny it and we can have war happen anyway, and probably happen more frequently and probably happen worse than if we'd tried to manage it. Now Schmitt, as with many realists, I think hopefully most realists, doesn't really like that this is the case. It would be lovely if the world wasn't a world in which conflict was this fundamental kind of thing. But he sees himself as just describing the way the world is, right? He isn't advocating for a world of war. He's just saying that's how things are. That's just this fundamental fact of the world that we have to accept. So he says that there exists no rational purpose, no norm, no matter how true, no program, no matter how exemplary, no social ideal, no matter how beautiful, no legitimacy or legality that could justify men killing each other in this way. So he's not a fan at all of violent conflict, but he just thinks, it exists, right? There's nothing you can do about it. So this idea of justification, this idea of morality, he thinks is just not relevant to the question of politics. So we've got this world in which people form collectivities, they form different groups, and then they fight for the existence of these collectivities. And everything else, he thinks, all these other justifications and reasons for war, it's just window dressing, basically. It hides this basic source of conflict, that there are collectivities and they need to fight for their existence against other collectivities. The important thing about this division, though, is that while this distinction represents, for Schmitt, the utmost degree of intensity of a union or separation, of an association or dissociation. So, if someone is the enemy, then they have the utmost intensity of separation from you. They have the utmost disassociation from you. This doesn't actually mean that he thinks the enemy is evil or repulsive or anything like that, right? Because he thinks morality, these are moral terms, right? Or aesthetic terms, and he thinks this has nothing to do with politics. In politics, the enemy doesn't even need to be an economic competitor. And Schmitt thinks that we can enter business relations with someone who is the enemy. The key thing for Schmitt is not that they're repulsive or evil. Rather, the enemy is simply the other, the stranger. They are, he thinks, in an especially intense way, existentially something different and alien, so that in the extreme case, conflicts with them are always possible. Right, so the political world is a world with these divisions between people, between collectivities. And the enemy doesn't have to be bad, doesn't have to be evil, doesn't have to be repulsive. They don't have to have a different religion. They don't have to have a different morality or a different aesthetic sensibility. They just have to be not us. That's all it really means. So this is a world in which we're willing to fight and die for no more reason than the fact that we're on one side of a dividing line and the people we're fighting are on the other side of that dividing line. It's a distinction based purely on the fact that the enemy intends to negate our existence as a collectivity if they were to prevail in a conflict with us. Now, an important aspect of the friend-enemy distinction is the contrast that Schmitt draws between hostis and inimicus. So both hostis and inimicus are Latin words that mean enemy, but the way Schmitt uses them, they refer to quite different things. So inimicus, the root of the English word inimical, it refers to private enemies, so people who harm us as individuals. So a mugger is our enemy, right? But they're not our enemy in a way that relates in any way to politics. So my enmity, my conflict with a mugger is not a political conflict, it's a private conflict. And Schmitt thinks as well that disagreements within a collectivity, they're not a matter of hostis, they're inimicus, right? They're private matters within a group, they're not politics. Hostis, on the other hand, the root of the English word hostile, obviously, refers to public enemies. So a public enemy is an enemy of the collective who are themselves a collective. And Schmitt thinks it's only this kind of relationship, it's only this kind of conflict, a public distinction between friend and enemy based in hostis instead of inimicus, that gives us politics. This is a political conflict. However, it's not at all obvious, I think, that the distinction between hostis and inimicus is quite so easy to draw. I mean, there are some pretty clear cases, right? War between nations is clearly hostis, and a murder for personal motivations is clearly inimicus. But there are probably lots of cases in the middle that aren't quite so obvious. So civil war could be a good example of this. So in civil war, what was clearly a collectivity before ceases to be a collectivity, right? But if Schmitt thinks that a conflict is inimicus when it's within those, within the same collectivity, right, and hostis when it's between collectivities, between people in different collectivities, how do we make sense of civil war according to this distinction? Because a civil war starts off as a conflict based in inimicus. It's a private conflict, right? It's about disagreements within a particular collectivity. But presumably it ends with the creation of a new state or a new group of people, in which case the conflict is now clearly hostis. So quite how to make sense of cases like this is not fully clear in Schmitt's thought. But it's another reason perhaps to think that Schmitt doesn't see the state as being any kind of fundamental basic unit in international politics. All right, so I've presented his idea of sovereignty and his idea of politics, based on this friend-enemy distinction. And I've presented them as being these separate things, but in fact Schmitt thinks they're quite deeply related to each other. So, really important, recall, the enemy is not an enemy because of anything in their nature, right? It's not because of their religion or their morality or their economic clout or anything like that, right? An enemy is an enemy because they're just an existential threat to other groups. But, as in the case of law, this isn't something that just naturally happens, right? It isn't like we wake up one day and we just decide, we wake up one day and it just happens to be the case that another group is suddenly our enemy, right? We need to decide that they're the enemy. So politics for Schmitt is that moment where the distinction between friend and enemy is actually made, right? Where the decision between friend and enemy is actually made. And who makes that decision? Who has the power to decide? Well, the sovereign has the power to decide. So the decision about who is a friend and who is an enemy is a matter for the exception, right? It's not a matter for the everyday functioning of a legal system, of a legal order. We can't just read off from a particular legal system who counts as a friend and who counts as an enemy. It escapes this legal order. And so we need a sovereign to decide, and in deciding, they make it the case that someone is friend and someone is enemy, right? And Schmitt thinks that it's in these moments of decision, these moments of exception, that the truly political can be seen. Right, the final idea of Schmitt's that I want to consider is that of the nomos. So the nomos is kind of a tricky idea, sometimes translated as international law, but this doesn't really quite get at what Schmitt's trying to say. Because international law is, of course, these legal norms, these agreements that constitute a particular international legal order. It's a set of rules about how a state should relate to other states, or how states should relate to each other. And this, the idea of the nomos captures this a little bit. But nomos goes even deeper than this. It's more fundamental than the idea of international law. A nomos is the basic way that an international order is constituted. Right? It's an order of what exists and how those things fundamentally relate to each other. And that's more than just a set of rules, right? Now, the particularly interesting thing to me about Schmitt's idea of the nomos is the way that it historicizes a particular state system. So realist scholars, as we've discussed, they tend to treat the state system as this natural backdrop, which they can do their theorizing against. To the extent that the current state system is a question, or is thought of as something worth thinking about for realists, it's seen as merely maybe the latest manifestation of this long history of power relations that repeats basically in the same form throughout time. Schmitt, though, he provides an account of the modern state system that sees it as a product of a particular kind of world. And really importantly, he sees, or he suggests that the state system as we understand it now is on the way out. Schmitt's idea is that the particular nomos that we associate with the modern state system, right, what he calls the ius publicum Europaeum, started with the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, and he thinks since the Second World War it's been in decline, and it's eventually going to be replaced with a new nomos. Now, one of the basic ideas of a nomos that makes it more fundamental than just international law is that it's always at the same time as a set of rules or a set of understandings, a spatial ordering of the world, right? It's a way of ordering space and making sense of space. And for Schmitt, the spatial ordering is actually more fundamental than the legal ordering. So for Schmitt, a global nomos, a fundamental spatial and legal order in which the entire world is implicated, is captured, could only happen in the modern era. And this is because a global spatial ordering of the world could only occur after the development of what he calls global linear thinking. Now, global linear thinking is a way of thinking about space that's fundamentally tied to the historical event of land appropriation. And in particular, he thinks the appropriation of the New World. So when the first maps and the first globes were produced, the first lines were drawn by the appropriating European powers in order to divide and distribute the New World amongst them. The need to permit, right, and legally justify this appropriation, the appropriation of the New World, led to the creation of the Westphalian state system. Because the land appropriation, because this land appropriation led to a particular understanding of the world. I'm lost. Yeah. This land appropriation led to a particular understanding of the world. It led to a particular understanding of how space is ordered, right? Because on the one hand, we have the free, open space of the New World, right? Free, open space of the New World that can be claimed by European powers. So we have this idea that this is space that's free to be taken, and that the people who inhabit that space just don't count. And on the other hand, we have Europe, right, a land divided amongst these secular states who view each other as those who can do the claiming, right? So you've got the free open space on the one hand, and you've got the states who can claim that open space on the other hand. So we get this distinction, the land of those who can claim and the land that can be claimed. And also the land, those who can claim and those who aren't allowed to claim, who don't have the authority to claim. So we have a world in which Europeans see each other as equals, right, as collectively above everyone else in the world. And those in America particularly they thought of as not equals, right? But neither did they really see anyone else in the world as equals either. Africa and the Middle East or Australasia were not equals. And so they divided the world in this way. You have the European world and you have the non-European world. And this is distinguished by this really sharp line, those who count and those who don't count. Now the consequence of this for Schmitt is that it bracketed war. So this free space of the Americas was left open for struggles between European states, but conflict within Europe became highly regulated. Right? So Schmitt describes war in Europe as becoming rationalized and humanized. So previously, war was far more brutal. War in Europe was far more brutal. You had religious wars, you had factional wars, and they were wars in which the enemy was treated as a criminal, and in which the aim was to annihilate the opponent. They were really the enemy. Colonial wars too were aimed at conquering, subjugating, or eliminating what Europe considered wild peoples. The war in form of European states, on the other hand, in this period, was a war of a limited kind. The European interstate system tried, at least in Europe, to prevent these wars of annihilation. It didn't try to prevent war. You couldn't prevent war. Schmitt thinks it's impossible to prevent war. Any attempt to prevent it is doomed to fail and probably to lead to worse consequences. But instead, we had a war in form, right? And this war in form was focused on trying to gauge the opponent's strength. This could be through, trying to appropriate their lands by force in the New World, or it could be by fighting limited wars on European soil. Either way, though, other European states were always considered justus hostis, or a just enemy. So war between European states became to be considered something like a duel. Right? Different members of this European family would engage with each other according to certain agreed upon rules, and therefore, the other European states were just enemies. Right? So war in Europe became just. All war became just. All war between European states became just. Now, you might think this is a bad thing, saying that wars are just wars, but the way this nomos worked is that in removing a cause of war, right, and making war simply a matter of testing your strength against this just enemy, right, rather than for the purpose of, for any kind of purpose, religious conflict, moral disagreement, whatever, war ceased to be about annihilating, it ceased to be about destroying your enemy. If war is about justice, right, then you're justified in destroying your enemy. Right? Your enemies are unjust. Your enemies are evil. The purpose of war, in this way of thinking about things, is not to defeat your enemy, but to bring about justice. Right? So there are potentially no limits to that war. If justice means wiping your enemy off the face of the earth, then so be it. This kind of war was no longer possible in Europe, he thinks. And the development of this system also made possible the development of the balance of power, right? The idea that European states were in this more or less stable arrangement. War could occur, and it did occur, but it was a war aimed not at destruction, but at ensuring or maybe restoring a balanced relationship between equals. It also allowed for there to be territorial shifts within Europe, right? But it did this without endangering the European system as a whole. And again, this is because Europe became a community of states in which conflict between states was considered to be a legitimate concern of all of the other European states, all part of this family, this overarching system. So it was seen as the role of the great powers of Europe to guarantee this overall system. They were looked to recognize these territorial changes and to provide their backing for them to say, yeah, that's fine, go for that. So the basic idea then is that the nomos of the earth developed thanks to the New World and this distinction that was then created between Europe and non-Europe. And this allowed war in Europe, not elsewhere, but in Europe, to be contained. It permitted war. Schmitt thinks you can never escape war entirely, but the war became bracketed. It became limited. It was no longer aiming at destroying other states, because other states were moral equals, right? Part of the same community, part of the same family. And in fact, the term bracket, higung, can also mean pruning, right? So we can think of war in such a system as necessary maintenance to keep things in good health, right? In the same way that you prune your garden in order to help things grow in the garden. Now, based on all I've said, it may sound as if Schmitt was in favor of this system, and perhaps to an extent he was, but his main concern was describing the way things were. So he's not advocating in favor of colonialism, but he does acknowledge the role that colonialism played in developing this particular nomos. Right? He sought to describe the way in which the creation of a core, Europe, and the periphery, the free spaces of the New World, as well as this process of land appropriation in the New World, gave rise to this particular spatial and legal ordering of the world. Right? You tried to provide an account of the fundamental structure that gave rise to the modern European state. Now, of course, at the same time, he recognized the benefits of this particular nomos for Europe. Right? This limited war made possible a relatively stable state system, and it prevented, again within Europe, but not elsewhere, wars of annihilation. But Schmitt argued that this Westphalian state system, the Jus Publicum Europaeum, was actually on the way out. And he thinks this disintegration started to happen around the time of the First World War. Now, Schmitt blames this degeneration on the creation of international law and the League of Nations, as well as the rise of the United States, and like the concomitant removal of Europe as the center of the world. So when the United States rose in power, Europe just ceased to be the core, ceased to be the center of the world. Now, the League of Nations is problematic for Schmitt because it tried to criminalize, it tried to abolish war. Right? So in the Jus Publicum Europaeum, war was allowed, but it was limited, it was bracketed. In criminalizing war, the League of Nations removed the possibility of these limited, bracketed wars. And Schmitt thinks that it was the criminalization, it was this criminalization that led to the total war of World War II. Because, in World War II, the enemy was absolute, right? They were no longer moral equals, they were this absolute total enemy. The enemy was a criminal, they were an existential threat to humanity itself. So Schmitt thinks the League of Nations, in criminalizing war, brought back the idea of war for a cause, right? It made possible again wars fought in the name of humanity, and therefore wars fought with the aim of annihilating the enemy. Now, regarding the United States, during the interwar years, the US ceased to be isolationist in its foreign policy, and instead it adopted this policy of pan-interventionism. So it adopted this universalistic humanitarian foreign policy that saw itself as having the right to intervene anywhere in the world, at any time, for any reason. Right? It saw itself as having the right to interfere in the political, the social, the economic affairs of other nations whenever it suited them. And we can see these ideas in the concept of humanitarian intervention, right? Which was this, this was an anathema to the Westphalian state system. In the Westphalian state system, the internal affairs of a state, a European state at least, were no one else's business. So this idea of this universalistic humanitarian pan-interventionism, it recuperated this just war tradition and made the actions of the US internationally not just conflict, or no longer conflicts between equals, but instead as police actions. So in other words, it made these interventions actions based on the idea of right and wrong, justice and injustice, and therefore unable to be bracketed, unable to be limited in the way that was possible previously. And think here, the global war on terror is a good example of this, right? The global war on terror is portrayed as this existential struggle. It's either them or us, it's either justice or it's evil. And this, in the Westphalian state system, this was just a nonsense kind of idea. So since Europe was no longer the center of the world, no longer the group of states that had the power to decide the spatial ordering of the rest of the world, then the Jus Publicum Europaeum could just no longer continue. Now, this idea of the nomos of the earth, I think, is particularly interesting for critical theory in two ways. First, since the discovery of the New World is a singular historical event, right? It's an event that can't, by its very nature, be repeated, then if the Westphalian state system relied on that event for its existence, the realist view that the current system is merely the iteration of the same basic thing occurring throughout history cannot possibly be right. Right? Quite the contrary. That state system, this realist state system, is absolutely unrepeatable. It's historically situated. It's a historically situated way of organizing the world, of organizing the relationship between groups in the world. And so Schmitt allows us to historicize the state system and understand the specific factors that went into a certain system, into the creation of a certain system at a certain time, and understanding the fundamental norms that underpin that system. Secondly, from the perspective of post-colonial international relations, and we'll be thinking more about post-colonial international relations after the break, this view acknowledges how fundamentally important colonialism was to understanding modern international relations. Because for realists, colonialism is just not even on the radar, really. It's not really something that gets much attention from realists. But if Schmitt's account is right, then understanding colonialism is absolutely inseparable from understanding international politics more generally. Okay, so that's where I want to stop today. Next, on Thursday, we're looking at Giorgio Agamben, who takes the idea of the exception up in a slightly different way.